The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon over the Dutch countryside when Captain Johan van der Koop received the order that would transform him from defender into destroyer. The telegram arrived at his airfield just outside Amsterdam with a simplicity that belied its weight, instructing him to prepare demolition charges for every aircraft, every fuel depot, every piece of equipment that might prove useful to an advancing enemy. What the order didn't say, what it couldn't say in the sterile language of military command, was that he would need to make this decision while his fellow pilots were still sleeping in barracks only 200 meters from the runways, while mechanics were brewing their morning coffee in workshops that would soon become targets, while the entire infrastructure of their resistance hung in the balance between survival and surrender. This was May 1940, and the German invasion of the Netherlands had begun with a brutality that caught even seasoned military observers off guard. The Luftwaffe had crossed the border in the pre-dawn darkness, their bombers appearing as dark crosses against a sky that had promised nothing more threatening than spring rain. Within hours, reports flooded into Dutch command posts describing scenes that seemed impossible, bridges captured intact by paratroopers who had landed in fields still wet with morning dew, entire defensive positions bypassed by forces moving with a speed that suggested they had rehearsed these very roads in peacetime. The careful plans that Dutch strategists had developed over months of anxious preparation were crumbling with a speed that left commanders scrambling to understand not just what was happening, but what had already happened before they could react. Van der Koop stood at the window of the operations building, watching his squadron prepare for what they believed would be another day of defensive patrols. The Fokker aircraft sat in neat rows, their engines cold but ready, their ammunition belts loaded by armorers who had worked through the night. These machines represented years of military investment, scarce resources allocated carefully in a nation that had clung to neutrality even as war consumed the continent around them. More importantly, they represented capability, the ability to contest airspace, to provide reconnaissance, to offer at least some resistance to an enemy whose air superiority had already proven decisive in Poland and would soon demonstrate the same overwhelming advantage here. The captain understood with a clarity that felt like nausea that every aircraft left intact would fly against his own country within days, piloted by German aviators or used to train them, contributing to a war machine that was already proving unstoppable. The tactical situation had deteriorated with a speed that military doctrine had never adequately prepared anyone to handle. German forces were reported approaching from multiple directions, their advance units moving faster than retreating Dutch forces could establish new defensive lines. Communication networks were failing as forward observation posts went silent, leading headquarters to piece together the invasion's progress from fragmentary reports and increasingly desperate radio transmissions. What made the situation particularly acute for Van der Koop's airfield was its location, positioned near enough to the German advance that capture seemed not a possibility but an inevitability, yet far enough behind the collapsing front that no clear evacuation route existed. The original defensive planning had assumed gradual withdrawal with time to relocate assets and personnel in an orderly fashion. Reality had provided neither time nor order. Van der Koop had served long enough to understand that military careers were built on decisions made in moments that allowed no time for proper analysis. He knew that other commanders facing similar circumstances might interpret their orders differently, might find justifications for delay or partial compliance, might preserve some equipment with the reasoning that it could be hidden or sabotaged later if needed. The calculus was genuinely uncertain because the speed of the German advance meant that assumptions about when capture would occur kept changing with each new report. An airfield that seemed hours away from being overrun might have days if defensive lines stabilized. Equipment destroyed prematurely was lost forever, but equipment preserved too long would serve the enemy. The decision required him to bet on outcomes he couldn't possibly predict with information that was already outdated by the time it reached him. The human dimension of this choice pressed against him with a weight that pure military logic couldn't address. His pilots were exhausted from near-continuous operations since the invasion began, flying patrol after patrol in aircraft that were already outclassed by German fighters. They had watched friends die in uneven dogfights against Messerschmitts that could outclimb and outgun their Fokkers, had returned to base with aircraft so damaged that mechanics shook their heads in disbelief that the machines had remained airborne. Now they prepared for another day of flying, another day of pretending that their determination might somehow balance the enormous disparity in equipment and numbers. Van der Koop would need to destroy their aircraft while they still believed in the mission. while they still retained enough hope that their sacrifice might matter. The psychological impact of this, the message it would send about their command's assessment of the situation, was something no training had prepared him to manage. The demolition preparations began with a quiet efficiency that felt surreal given the magnitude of what they signified. Engineers who normally maintained and repaired aircraft now calculated optimal placement of explosive charges to ensure complete destruction. Fuel that should have powered defensive operations was instead designated as accelerant to guarantee that fires burned hot enough to melt aluminum airframes into unusable scrap. Ammunition that had been carefully conserved for combat operations was removed from storage bunkers and positioned where its sympathetic detonation would contribute to the overall devastation. The men carrying out these preparations understood what they were doing, but understanding and accepting were entirely different states of mind. They worked with the mechanical precision of people performing tasks too enormous to fully process, focusing on technical details because the larger implications threatened to overwhelm rational thought. As the afternoon progressed, the sounds of war grew closer with an inexorability that made abstract orders into concrete reality. Artillery fire rumbled in the distance, a deep percussion that could be felt through the ground before it reached the ears. Smoke columns rose from towns that had been occupied within hours of the invasion's start. Their church steeples and civic buildings transformed into navigation markers for German forces moving through unfamiliar territory. Refugees began appearing on roads near the airfield, civilian families pushing carts loaded with whatever possessions they had managed to gather, their presence a stark reminder that military decisions had consequences far beyond their immediate tactical objectives. These people had trusted that their military would protect them, that neutrality might be honored, that war was something that happened elsewhere. Their stunned expressions suggested they were still struggling to understand how completely those assumptions had failed. Van der Kolk received updated intelligence reports throughout the afternoon, each one narrowing his window for decision. German mechanized units were advancing faster than initial estimates had predicted, their motorcycle reconnaissance elements already probing routes toward the airfield. Dutch forces attempting to slow this advance were being bypassed rather than engaged, the Germans demonstrating a tactical sophistication that prioritized speed over securing every position. This meant that the captain's assessment of how much time remained was constantly being revised downward, each revision making the decision to destroy his base more pressing and more final. There would be no second chance, no opportunity to reconsider once demolition began. The charges once detonated would transform months of preparation and millions in military investment into rubble in a matter of minutes. The order to evacuate non-essential personnel came as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Clerks and administrative staff, mechanics who weren't needed for the demolition itself, support personnel who maintained the base infrastructure, all were directed to gather personal effects and prepare for withdrawal to positions further west. The scene at the main gate captured everything wrong with the situation. Military trucks loaded with people who had woken that morning, expecting a normal day of work, now leaving behind the base that many had served it for years. Some looked back at the buildings and hangars with expressions that suggested they understood what was about to happen. Others seemed to believe this was temporary, that they would return once the situation stabilized. Van der Kolk knew that neither group would find what they hoped for in the days ahead. The pilots presented a more complicated problem because their skills made them valuable even without aircraft to fly. Van der Kolk gathered them in the operations building. As evening approached, the room lit by lamps because blackout procedures were now in effect. He explained the situation with a directness that military culture sometimes discouraged, but that circumstances now demanded. The airfield would be destroyed to prevent its capture. Their aircraft would be blown up or burned. Equipment that couldn't be demolished would be sabotaged beyond repair. The invasion had progressed to the point where continued operations from this location were impossible, and preservation of assets would only serve the enemy. He watched their faces as they processed this information, seeing the calculation each man was performing, weighing their training and duty against the fundamental wrongness of destroying what they had been taught to protect and preserve. One pilot, a lieutenant who had shot down 2 German aircraft in the war's opening days, asked the question that others were thinking but hadn't voiced. Why destroy everything when they could fly the aircraft out, relocate to bases further from the German advance, continue operations from positions that might remain viable? It was a reasonable question that deserved an honest answer. Van der Kolk explained what intelligence reports indicated about German air superiority, about how many Dutch aircraft had already been destroyed on the ground or shot down, about how the entire defensive situation was collapsing faster than new positions could be established. Flying the aircraft out would simply delay their destruction while consuming fuel and risking pilots' lives in transit. The hard truth was that these aircraft were already lost. The only question was whether they would be lost to demolition or capture. The night brought a darkness that felt complete despite scattered fires burning in the distance. Van der Kolk had ordered the demolition to proceed at dawn, giving his men a few hours to rest and himself time to verify that the German advance hadn't suddenly accelerated beyond what reports indicated. He walked the perimeter of the airfield in the early morning hours, accompanied by the senior engineer who had overseen the demolition preparations. They checked each charge, each fuel dump prepared for ignition, each piece of equipment positioned for maximum destruction. The engineer, a veteran of the previous war, spoke quietly about the waste of it all, about how the same resources that went into building this base could have been used for any number of constructive purposes. It was a philosophical observation that war rarely allowed time for, yet here in the darkness before destroying everything they had worked to build, it seemed like the only thing worth saying. The horizon began to lighten with that gray pre-dawn glow that transforms night into morning without quite becoming either. Van der Kolk returned to the operations building and confirmed with headquarters that the order remained in effect, that no change in the tactical situation had made demolition unnecessary. The response came back within minutes, confirming that German forces were indeed approaching the airfield's location and that destruction of all military assets remained imperative. There would be no reprieve, no last-minute rescue of the situation by forces that didn't exist or miracle interventions that occurred only in propaganda films. The captain gathered the small team that would remain to execute the demolition, explaining the sequence of destruction and the timing that would give them the best chance to complete the mission and withdraw before German forces arrived. The first explosions came as the sun broke above the distant tree line, charges detonating under aircraft with a violence that lifted the machine briefly before they collapsed into twisted metal. The sound rolled across the airfield in waves, each detonation followed by secondary explosions as fuel tanks ruptured and ammunition cooked off in the growing fires. Hangars that had protected aircraft from weather now channeled blast effects that ensured nothing inside would remain functional. The precision that had gone into planning the demolition was evident in how thoroughly each target was destroyed. No half measures or symbolic gestures, only complete annihilation of everything that might serve an enemy's purpose. Van der Kolk stood near the operations building, watching his command transform into an inferno. The heat was intense even at a distance, the fires generating their own wind that pulled loose papers and debris toward the flames. Fuel dumps ignited with a roar that seemed to come from deep underground. Pillars of black smoke rising into the morning sky where they would be visible for dozens of kilometers. This smoke would serve as a beacon for German forces, telling them exactly where to find the airfield they were advancing toward. But by the time they arrived, there would be nothing left to capture, beyond scorched earth and wreckage. The captain felt no satisfaction in this, no sense of victory or even successful completion of an assigned mission. He felt only the hollowness that comes from being forced to destroy rather than build, to end rather than preserve. The withdrawal happened quickly once the demolition sequence was complete, the small team moving to trucks that had been positioned for rapid evacuation. They drove west through countryside that showed increasing signs of war's approach, abandoned defensive positions where soldiers had retreated before German armor, small towns where residents were, boarding windows and hiding valuables in preparation for occupation. The airfield they left behind would burn for hours, the fires consuming everything that explosives hadn't already destroyed. Van der Kolk looked back once as they drove away, seeing the smoke column that marked where his command had existed until minutes ago. He understood that similar scenes were playing out across the Netherlands as the invasion overwhelmed defensive positions, but understanding the larger context provided no comfort in the immediate loss. The Dutch surrender came days later, the government forced to acknowledge that continued resistance would achieve nothing beyond additional casualties and destruction. The speed of the German victory shocked military observers, who had expected the campaign to last weeks rather than days. The Luftwaffe's air superiority and Wehrmacht's tactical skill overwhelming. Defensive forces that had prepared for a different kind of war. Van der Kolk and his surviving pilots spent the occupation years in a strange limbo. Experienced military aviators with no aircraft to fly, watching their former airfields serve the very enemy they had worked to resist. The captain never learned what happened to the wreckage of his demolished base, whether German forces simply cleared the debris, or whether any remnants remained as testimony to a decision made in circumstances that allowed no good options. Years after the war ended, when veterans gathered to share stories and historians began documenting the invasion's details, Van der Kolk's demolition of his own base appeared in accounts as a footnote, one minor incident among thousands in a campaign that had lasted less than a week. But for the captain and the men who had executed those orders, the memory remained vivid, with an intensity that time did little to diminish. They had been forced to destroy what they were trained to protect, to render useless what represented their country's capability to resist, to acknowledge through action that the war was lost before it had properly begun. The decision had been correct by any reasonable military standard, denying the enemy resources they would have immediately employed against Dutch and Allied forces. Yet correctness provided no solace when the cost was measured not just in destroyed equipment, but in shattered assumptions about what duty might require and what orders might demand. The bombs that fell on his own base, detonated by his own hand, destroyed more than aircraft and infrastructure. They destroyed the comfortable certainty that war would allow commanders to always act as protectors rather than occasionally as destroyers. That military service meant building strength rather than sometimes acknowledging its futility. In the calculus of total war, Van der Kolk's demolition was a rational choice that prevented enemy exploitation of valuable assets. In the memory of the man who gave the order and the men who carried it out, it remained the day they bombed their own base because invasion moved faster than hope, and duty required destruction when preservation meant collaboration with conquest.